Having completed the first half of the first turn, I'm now going to proceed to the second half of the first turn. Each of our turns has two halves to it. As you saw, there was 8 phases during the first half of the turn, and I'm going to go through the same 8 phases for the second half of the turn. So all told, the turn has got roughly 16 phases. In recap, it's the MFP, a charge declaration phase for one side or the other, a rally phase for the same side, then the movement phase, then there's the command phase, then there's the shock combat phase, a mutual artillery fire phase, and a small arms fire phase. As I go through the phases, you're going to notice that if the French did it in the last half of the turn, it's now going to be the Sardinian half of the turn to do the same action. We've exchanged positions, shall we say. So even though the two halves of the turn look fairly identical, who does what action at certain phase is usually the opposite to the other side, depending upon which half of the phase you're in. With that being discussed, let's go to the second half of the turn. It's now basically the Sardinian half of the game turn because they're the ones that are going to be moving. So the first thing that comes up is the MFP phase. Since we're not really bookkeeping the MFPs for this game, I'll skip past that phase. Right after that comes the French charge declaration phase. Notice it's opposite to what we did in the first half of the turn when it was the Sardinians' opportunity. But since they have no cavalry on the field and we don't count the general, that phase is going to get skipped by. Then comes the French rally phase, and if any of those 3 French battalions had suffered a morale disorder for some reason in the last fire phases maybe, this is when they might have had an opportunity to rally up. But since there's no morale disordered units or even routing units on the tabletop, I can skip past that phase too. It then comes to the Sardinian movement phase, and as before, this is when the Sardinians will do their facing and formation changes first, and then physically move the units. Now up here in the castle, I move by zones for today's scenario. I don't actually move and measure and wheel and things of that nature. I just pick up the figures and go from one zone to the other. You move by the zones. It just makes it easier for me to represent movement within the castle, because I've equivocated it to 3 separate building type structures. In the Sardinian movement phase, they look pretty good. They're in about the best position they could be for right now, so I'm going to leave it as such. All the units will stand pat. Now at this particular phase, I'm going to actually attach Del Cagliaretto to the Sardinian battalion, increasing their morale and leadership and combative capacity. As for the French, I'm going to bring the French general up and attach him to one of these battalions to likewise increase their capabilities. Notice both sides get to move in the command phases. It then comes down to the shock phase. And as I explained before, this is when the French will actually perform their shock, because the Sardinian side, or the Sardinian Piedmontese Grenadiers, have had an opportunity to avoid the shock, march away, do things of that nature, or elect to stand in place and take it. In this case, they're electing to take it. To the shock phase, in this particular case, the French infantry shock segment. Now, when it comes to the shock phase, the first thing I have to determine is which of my French columns is going to go first. Notice in our game that we don't apply all the Frenchmen as one result against all the defenders at one point in time. We make our shock combats based upon the frontage of each individual unit, so therefore there's one shock combat here and there's one shock combat here, i.e. total 2 French shock combats. And in the game it could make a difference of which one goes first, because if there's a repulse or something of that nature, it will affect, as possible morale checks, friendly units if they happen to rout away. Having determined that I'm going to use this battalion for the first French assault, I have to now make a determination of will the Sardinian Grenadiers stand and hold. This is basically a morale check. They're going to get some modifiers to hold because of the wall and because they have the attached general. Well, the Grenadiers have a base morale or combat efficiency, CMR, of 8. The general is going to add back 1 because he's directly attached, or if he was in the radius, you do the same thing, which makes him a 9. And the walls of the castle gives them 2 more, which makes it an 11. Pretty hard to fail with an 11 on a 10-sided dice. The only other modifier that might apply is there's so many Frenchmen coming in on each of the assaults, and I rate by individual assault here, by the way. They have 8 figures to 4, that's 200%, and on the shock combat chart they would show a -1 for the defending roll. So 11 minus 1 makes it a 10. As long as I roll a 10 or less on the dice, which I roll a 1, that's perfectly fine. Okay, rolled a 1. In the game, if you roll a 1 in the shock combat phase, you artificially increase the value of the unit that rolled the 1 up by 1 for the entire shock combat phase. This applies for morale and combative actions. If you roll conversely a natural 0, which is a 10, you're -1 for morale checks in addition to any other modifiers, and also -1 for the shock combat differential in the shock table. It's sort of an extra fudge factor in our game to adjust the basic combat and morale capabilities of individual units in the shock phase. Having rolled the 1, the Sardinian Grenadiers held in place firmly on the wall under the leadership of Del Carretto, so they're going to now perform their final shock fire. And final shock fire is just like any other fire, except it's doubled. So we had a 48% base last time, we now have a 96% base to inflict a loss on the French. And they roll a 90. Well, that's enough to cause the loss of 1 Frenchman. And consequently, it's going to force a morale check on this French battalion. They've lost a figure. In addition, since the general is directly attached to the unit, there's a chance for him to be hit. It's 5% per hit. In this case, I rolled a 70, so the general passes, in this case, his firepower check. Next comes I have to take the morale check for the French unit that actually lost the figure. Normally, this unit would have a morale grade or CMR of 6. Loss of a figure, it makes it a 5. The general, since he's in the radius of 9 inches or is directly attached, is going to add back 1, which makes it back to a 6. It also, since it started as an 8-figure unit, which we construe as being a large unit in our game, it's going to get an extra +1 for its morale checks. Not in combat, just for morale checks, simply because of the size of the unit. So that makes them a 7. I roll a 3, they pass morale. If I had rolled above a 7, then there's a status for possible of going into morale disorder or actually routing. But in this case, they passed. So let's go to the actual shock combat itself. They're coming flying in. And notice I'm doing all these actions for this assault. All the actions are completed for this group before I even start rolling this group. We view these assaults as not coming in simultaneous from a game mechanics point of view. Alright, go to the shock table. Here we have our odds, and here we have a differential chart, which gives us 6 outcomes if you cross-index. What that politely means is I have to calculate the odds first. Well, the odds are 7 figures to 4. That rounds down to 150%. So I'd find the chart, and it's 150%. It would be this band of 6 possible outcomes someplace in here that I have to now determine based upon the differential. And the differential is going to be calculated between the 2 units. The Sardinian Grenadiers start as an 8. Officer is going to give them a 9. And being behind the castle walls is another +3, which makes it a 12. In addition to that, they are an elite grade unit, so that will make it 13 for their final value. The French start with a 6. General's attached is a 7. Lost a figure is -1, so it takes them back down to a 6. In addition to that, they are a line grade unit, which is less than the elite grade, so they get no benefit for that. Elite grade units in our game are 8 or higher, line are considered 5 to 7, and militia grade units are considered 4 or less. That's off your basic starting CMR.